All right, let's talk about a president who, doesn't always make the highlight reels. Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, you might think, one-term president, how important could he be? Well, it turns out his single term landed at this huge turning point in American history, and the decisions he made, man, they echoed for a century. And really, it all boils down to this one question. Because the story of Hayes isn't just about the guy himself. It's about how the incredibly messy, chaotic way he became president set the stage for decades of change, for better and for much, much worse. So, let's get into it. To really get Hayes, you have to get the absolute crisis he walked into. See, Hayes was a former Union general, a guy with a reputation for being honest and level-headed. But the way he got to the White House was anything but calm. He became president after the election of 1876. And let me tell you, this was probably the most disputed, most controversial, most down-and-dirty election this country has ever seen. The results were just a mess, full of fraud claims. Nobody was sure who actually won. I mean, get this. The whole thing came down to a single electoral vote. Can you even imagine that today? After all this intense backroom dealing, a special commission finally hands the presidency to Hayes. And the margin? 185 to 184. It was so razor-thin, the country was practically holding its breath, on the verge of another massive crisis. Something had to give. A deal had to be made. And that deal became known as the Compromise of 1877. It was a political bargain that, yeah, it solved the immediate problem of who was going to be president, but, wow, it came with a staggering long-term cost. Here's the core of it. The Democrats, who were absolutely furious, agreed to let the Republican Hayes take office. So what did they get in return? The Republicans agreed to pull the last of the federal troops out of the South. Now, that might sound like a simple political trade, but its implications were monumental. So it really just boils down to these two things, right? Step 1, Hayes gets to be president. Step 2, the U.S. military packs up and leaves the former Confederacy for good. This single decision would end up defining Hayes' entire presidency. And, honestly, reshaping the whole nation. And you gotta understand, pulling those troops out, that wasn't just some military maneuver. No, this was the official final nail in the coffin for Reconstruction. You know, that whole post-Civil War project where the federal government was supposed to be protecting the civil rights of millions of newly freed Black Americans? Well, with this one single compromise, poof, it was over. Just like that. But that compromise, as huge as it wasn't the whole story. Once Hayes actually got the presidency, he turned his focus to another massive problem, cleaning up the government. After all the scandals of the previous administration, he was dead set on restoring some integrity to Washington. Back then, government basically ran on something called the spoils system. It was simple. You help a guy get elected, he gives you a government job. Doesn't matter if you're qualified, it's just a reward. Hayes hated this. He wanted a merit system where you got a job because you were actually good at it, because you passed an exam, not because you knew somebody. And he really went for it. He started investigating corruption. He took on these incredibly powerful party bosses. And he fought to prove that the president, not some backroom political machine, was in charge. He was really laying the foundation for our modern civil service. But here's the paradox. While Hayes was busy fighting for reform, the consequences of the deal that got him the presidency were creating brand new, massive problems. The country was so divided, and his one term was just rocked by one crisis after another. First and foremost, ending Reconstruction was an absolute disaster for civil rights. The second those federal troops were gone, southern states started passing all these discriminatory laws to crush the rights of Black citizens. And Hayes? He had very little political power, or maybe even the will, to do anything about it. Just look at his first year in office. It shows you just how fast everything went down. He's inaugurated in March, the last troops are pulled out in April, and by July, the whole country is on fire with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This was America's first huge national labor strike, and it was brutal. So, in a pretty wild twist of irony, Hayes, the guy who just pulled federal troops out of the South, now sends them right back into northern cities. But this time, it was to break up the strike and force the trains to run again. Sure, it restored order, but it made him a villain to working-class Americans who felt like he was just protecting the big corporations. So, how do we square all this? On one hand, you've got a reformer who brought amnesty back to the White House. On the other, you've got a president whose very first political act led to a historic catastrophe for civil rights. That's the contradiction at the heart of his legacy. You can see the paradox laid out so clearly when you just weigh the good against the bad. On the plus side, he restored trust in the presidency. He championed civil service reform, and he helped modernize the economy. But the negative side is just devastating. He ended Reconstruction, which kicked off a century of discrimination, and he used the military against his own citizens who were fighting for fair wages. And that's pretty much how historians see him now. He was a guy with integrity, for sure, trying to steer the ship through an unbelievably difficult storm. He brought stability when the country desperately needed it. But the price of that stability? Well, the compromises he made had these tragic, far-reaching consequences that maybe even he never saw coming. Which brings us to the final lingering question. Was he a pragmatic leader just doing the best he could to hold a fragile country together? Or was his presidency a tragic failure that sacrificed justice for the sake of a temporary, uneasy peace? The answer, just like the man himself, is really complicated.